Margaret Thornfield had always been an early riser, but on this particular Tuesday morning in September, she wished she had stayed in bed. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of ripening apples as she made her way through the rows of her century-old orchard, coffee mug in hand, following her usual morning inspection routine. What she discovered would change everything. Where yesterday there had been a pristine row of heritage apple trees, some planted by her grandfather's own hands, now lay a muddy scar cutting straight through her property. Tire tracks, deep and deliberate, carved a path that connected the new Meadowbrook Heights subdivision directly to the main road, bypassing the lengthy route the development's residents were supposed to take around her 40-acre farm. Margaret's coffee mug slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against a fallen branch. 6 magnificent trees lay toppled, their broken limbs still heavy with fruit that would never reach harvest. The Honeycrisp tree that had been her pride and joy for 15 years was split clean down the middle, its trunk showing the violent bite marks of a chainsaw. Those absolute. Margaret caught herself, though there was no one around to hear her curse. Her grandmother would have washed her mouth out with soap, but her grandmother had never had to deal with entitled suburbanites, who thought rural property was their personal shortcut. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed 911, then immediately hung up. This wasn't exactly an emergency, no one was dying. But her trees were. Her livelihood was bleeding sap into the Pennsylvania soil. Instead, she called Sheriff Danny Morrison, a man she'd known since he was a boy, stealing apples from these very trees. His familiar voice answered on the second ring. "Morning, Miss Margaret. What can I do for you?" "Danny, they've destroyed my orchard." Her voice cracked despite her efforts to stay composed. "Someone came through in the night and cut down my trees to make themselves a road." The silence stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Danny's voice returned, carefully controlled. "I'll be right over. Don't touch anything." While she waited, Margaret walked the devastated path, documenting everything with her phone camera. The route was clearly planned, connected perfectly with the paved road that dead-ended at the Meadowbrook Heights entrance. Someone had surveyed this, had calculated the most efficient route through her property, and had decided that her 100-year-old trees were an acceptable sacrifice for their convenience. She noticed fresh wood chips scattered around the stumps and bent to examine them. These weren't amateur cuts. Someone had hired professionals, had planned this destruction with military precision. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't vandalism or a prank. This was theft, pure and simple. They had stolen a piece of her family's legacy to save themselves 5 minutes of driving time. Margaret straightened her 72-year-old spine and looked toward the subdivision where morning commuters were already beginning to emerge from their identical houses. They had no idea what they had started. They thought they were dealing with some harmless old woman who would complain to the proper authorities and accept whatever meager compensation the system offered. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The sound of Danny's patrol car crunching up her gravel driveway snapped her back to the present. Phase 1 of what was about to become a very expensive lesson in respecting other people's property was about to begin. Sheriff Morrison's investigation moved quickly once he saw the destruction firsthand. The trail of evidence led straight to Richard Blackstone, the developer behind Meadowbrook Heights, and his newly formed homeowners association. What Margaret discovered about their operation made her blood boil with a fury she hadn't felt since her late husband's battle with cancer. Blackstone had apparently held an emergency meeting with the HOA board 3 nights ago, convincing them that the current route to the main road was unsafe and inefficient for their residents. The official meeting minutes, which Danny obtained within hours, revealed the stunning arrogance of their decision-making process. They had discussed Margaret's property as if it were an inconvenient obstacle, rather than someone's home and livelihood. The elderly woman living in the farmhouse appears to be alone and rarely uses that section of her property, the minutes read. The trees in question are overgrown and represent a fire hazard. We'll be doing her a favor by clearing them out. Margaret stared at the document in disbelief. They had surveilled her property, made assumptions about her life, and decided her trees were worthless, all without a single conversation with her. The hubris was breathtaking. The confrontation came that same afternoon. Margaret had barely finished giving her statement to Danny when a sleek black Mercedes pulled into her driveway, followed by 2 pickup trucks carrying landscaping equipment. Richard Blackstone emerged from the Mercedes like he owned the place, his expensive suit somehow managing to look casual and authoritative at the same time. "Miss Thornfield, I presume?" Blackstone's smile was all veneered teeth and calculated charm. "I'm Richard Blackstone from Meadowbrook Development. I believe there's been a misunderstanding about our improvement project." "Improvement project?" Margaret's voice could have frozen hellfire. "You cut down my trees without permission. That's called trespassing and destruction of property." Blackstone's smile never wavered. "Now, I understand you're upset, but let's look at the bigger picture here. We've created a safer route for emergency vehicles, improved property values for the entire area, and honestly, Those trees were past their prime anyway. Behind him, his crew was already unloading new saplings, generic maple trees that looked like they come from a big box store. Margaret realized with horror that he intended to replace her heritage apple trees with ornamental landscaping, as if that would somehow make everything even. "Those trees were planted by my grandfather in 1952, she said, her voice deadly quiet. "Each one produced over 200 pounds of apples annually. This orchard provides income for my retirement." Blackstone waved dismissively. "Look, lady, I get it. Change is hard, but progress waits for no one. I'm prepared to offer you fair compensation, say $500 per tree. That's more than generous for trees that old." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a cold calculation replacing the hot anger. $500 for trees that had taken decades to mature, that produced thousands of dollars worth of fruit annually, that connected her to 3 generations of family history. He was offering her pocket change and expecting gratitude. "The answer is no," she said simply. Blackstone's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. "I was hoping we could handle this neighborly-like, but if you want to get lawyers involved, that's your choice. Just remember, development always wins in the end. Always." He climbed back into his Mercedes, but not before instructing his crew to plant the replacement trees anyway. Margaret watched in stunned silence as they began digging holes where her apple trees had stood that morning. Sheriff Morrison returned just as the landscapers were finishing up. His face was grim as he approached Margaret, who was still standing exactly where Blackstone had left her. "I've got some bad news," Danny said. "Blackstone filed for an emergency easement 3 weeks ago, claiming the current road was a safety hazard. Somehow it got approved without you being notified. Legally speaking, you might actually have the right tow." "No." Margaret's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. "Legal and right are 2 different things, Danny. That man just told me development always wins." She looked at the ugly little maple saplings now planted in her devastated orchard. "We'll see about that." For the first time since childhood, Sheriff Morrison felt genuinely afraid of Margaret Thornfield. There was something in her eyes that reminded him of winter storms, beautiful, inevitable, and absolutely destructive to anyone foolish enough to stand in their path. Margaret's faith in the system died slowly, one bureaucratic stone wall at a time. What should have been a straightforward case of property destruction turned into a labyrinthine nightmare of permits, easements, and legal loopholes that seemed designed to protect developers at the expense of landowners. Her first stop was the county planning office, where she discovered that Blackstone's emergency easement had been approved by a single clerk during what was supposed to be a routine safety review. The clerk, a nervous young man named Todd, insisted everything was above board, but his hands shook as he showed her the paperwork. "See, here's the thing," Todd explained, avoiding her eyes. "When a developer claims public safety concerns, we have expedited procedures. Mr. Blackstone provided documentation showing that emergency vehicles couldn't navigate the current route efficiently." Margaret studied the documents. The emergency vehicle access study was a single page with no actual measurements, no consultation with the fire department, and no consideration of alternative solutions. It was a rubber stamp masquerading as due process. "You didn't think to notify the property owner?" Margaret asked. Todd shifted uncomfortably. "The notification was sent to your address of record. If you didn't receive it," Margaret knew she had received no such notification. She also knew that pursuing this particular lie would lead nowhere. The system was rigged, and Todd was just another cog in the machine. Her attorney, James Hendricks, confirmed her worst fears during their meeting the following week. James had handled her late husband's estate and had always been straight with her, which made his pessimistic assessment all the more crushing. "Margaret, I've been practicing property law for 30 years, and I've never seen an easement granted with so little oversight," he said, spreading the documents across his desk. "Normally, there would be surveys, environmental impact studies, property owner notifications with appeal periods. This whole thing stinks to high heaven." "So what can we do?" Margaret asked. James removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Realistically, we can file appeals, request investigations, demand proper compensation. But Blackstone has deep pockets and political connections. He's donated heavily to the county commissioner's campaigns, and his law firm employs half the judge's former clerks. We're looking at years of litigation with no guarantee of success." The meeting with the county commissioners was Margaret's breaking point. She sat in the sterile government conference room, surrounded by men in expensive suits who spoke about her property like it was a line item in a budget proposal. Commissioner Bradley, who had received a $50,000 campaign contribution from Blackstone Development according to public records, didn't even pretend to take her concerns seriously. "Mrs. Thornfield, I understand your frustration, but we have to balance individual property rights with community development needs," Bradley said in the tone one might use with a difficult child. Mr. Blackstone's project brings jobs and tax revenue to our county. Sometimes progress requires sacrifice. Sacrifice? Margaret's voice carried the weight of 3 generations of hard work. You're talking about my family's legacy like it's a business expense. Perhaps we can arrange for additional compensation, suggested Commissioner Walsh, a woman who had run on a platform of supporting local farmers. Mr. Blackstone mentioned he'd be willing to increase his offer. Margaret stood up slowly, feeling every one of her 72 years. You've already decided, haven't you? This whole meeting is just theater. The uncomfortable silence that followed was answer enough. Walking to her truck after the meeting, Margaret felt something fundamental shift inside her. For 3 weeks, she had played by their rules, trusted their system, believed that justice would prevail if she just followed the proper procedures. She had been naive. Her phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor, Frank Patterson, who lived on the adjacent property. The message contained a photo of Blackstone's crew expanding their unauthorized road, now cutting into the buffer zone that was supposed to protect the wetlands behind Margaret's property. Harvey Morrison arrived at Margaret's farm the next morning with surveying equipment, decades of hydrological expertise, and a grin that suggested he was about to enjoy himself immensely. At 78, the retired engineer still moved with the purposeful stride of someone who had spent his career making water do exactly what he wanted it to do. Before we start plotting your revenge, Harvey said, setting up his transit on Margaret's front porch, you need to understand exactly what you're sitting on here. What Margaret learned over the next 4 hours changed everything she thought she knew about her own property. Her 40 acres weren't just a farm, they were the keystone of the entire regional drainage system. A series of natural springs fed into her property from the surrounding hills, creating a network of seasonal streams that had been channeled and managed by 3 generations of Thornfield farmers. Your grandfather was a genius, Harvey explained, showing Margaret a hand-drawn map her grandfather had created in the 1950s. He built this whole system to capture spring runoff and direct it around the farm buildings and channel it safely toward the main creek. But here's the beautiful part. He included overflow routes for heavy rain years. Harvey pointed to a series of berms and ditches that Margaret had always assumed were just part of the farm's natural topography. These aren't natural features. Your grandfather engineered them. And the legal beauty of it is, this predates every municipal water management ordinance in the county. You have grandfathered water rights that supersede everything else. The plan that emerged over the following days was elegantly simple. Margaret's grandfather had built the drainage system to handle spring floods by directing excess water away from populated areas. But that same system could be modified to send water toward populated areas instead, specifically toward the streets of Meadowbrook Heights subdivision. All we need to do is redirect 3 strategic channels, Harvey explained, sketching modifications on the original map. Block the normal drainage routes, open the overflow channels, and let gravity do the rest. When the autumn rains come, and the Weather Service is predicting a wet October, their precious subdivision is going to discover what happens when you mess with Mother Nature. Margaret hired Frank Patterson's construction crew under the guise of farm drainage improvements. Frank, who had watched Blackstone's bulldozers destroy his view of Margaret's orchard, was more than happy to help with what he assumed was legitimate farm maintenance. The work took 2 weeks and looked completely innocuous to casual observers. They installed new culverts under Margaret's access roads, cleared debris from existing drainage channels, and built what appeared to be simple erosion control berms. To anyone from the county who might happen to drive by, it looked like responsible land management. But Harvey's modifications were surgical in their precision. The new culverts would direct water from the seasonal streams directly toward the low-lying streets of Meadowbrook Heights. The erosion control berms would prevent water from following its traditional path toward the municipal storm drains, and the cleared channels would ensure maximum flow efficiency when the system activated. The beauty of this, Harvey explained as they put the finishing touches on the last diversion channel, is that you're not creating flooding. You're just restoring the natural drainage pattern that existed before the subdivision was built. Your grandfather's system was designed to protect populated areas by directing water away from them. We're simply returning the water to its historical flow path. Margaret felt a moment of doubt as she watched Frank's crew install the final piece of the puzzle, a remote-controlled gate system that would allow her to open and close the main overflow channel from her farmhouse. Harvey, are you sure this won't cause serious damage? I want them to learn a lesson, not lose their homes. Harvey consulted his calculations one more time. Margaret, we're talking about street flooding, not house flooding. These people built at the bottom of a natural drainage basin and then paved over all the ground that used to absorb runoff. They created their own problem. We're just making sure they understand the consequences of their choices. The first test came on October 12th, when a moderate thunderstorm dropped 2 inches of rain in 3 hours. Margaret stood at her kitchen window with the remote control in her hand, watching the water build up behind the temporary berms Harvey had constructed. When she pressed the button to open the overflow gates, the effect was immediate and spectacular. Within 30 minutes, what had been dry asphalt became a network of rushing streams. A subdivision's inadequate storm drains designed for light suburban runoff couldn't handle. October delivered on its promise with a vengeance. 3 major storm systems rolled through Pennsylvania in rapid succession, each one turning Meadowbrook Heights into an increasingly expensive disaster zone. By the end of the month, Margaret's modest drainage modifications had cost Richard Blackstone everything he had worked to build. The second storm hit on October 18th, dropping 4 inches of rain in 6 hours. This time, Margaret didn't need to use the remote control. Harvey's system activated automatically as the natural springs reached capacity. The subdivision's streets became rushing rivers that carried away landscaping, mailboxes, and 2 parked cars. The local news crews arrived to cover what they called unprecedented flooding in a previously safe residential area. Margaret watched the coverage from her dry farmhouse, noting with satisfaction that every reporter mentioned how the surrounding farms remained completely unaffected by the flooding. The message was clear to anyone paying attention. This wasn't a natural disaster, it was a man-made problem with a very specific cause. Blackstone's attempts at legal retaliation crumbled as quickly as his subdivision's property values. His emergency injunction to stop Margaret's illegal water diversion was thrown out when Harvey presented the original 1952 drainage plans to the court. The judge, an older man who remembered when the area was all farmland, was particularly interested in the historical precedent. "Mr. Blackstone," Judge Harrison said during the hearing, "you're asking this court to prevent Mrs. Thornfield from managing water flow on her own property using a system that predates your development by 70 years. Do you have any legal basis for that request?" Blackstone's attorney stammered through arguments about public safety and property damage, but the legal reality was inescapable. Margaret had grandfathered water rights, properly filed permits for her drainage improvements, and documentation proving her system simply restored historical flow patterns. Everything she had done was completely legal. The third storm arrived on Halloween night, a detail that Margaret found poetically appropriate. 6 inches of rain in 8 hours turned Meadowbrook Heights into a lake with water standing 3 feet deep in the lowest areas. The subdivision's storm drains, never designed to handle concentrated agricultural runoff, gave up entirely. Emergency services had to rescue 12 families from their flooded garages. By November 1st, the Homeowners Association was in open revolt against Blackstone. The emergency meeting, held in the community center because the HOA office was still flooded, deteriorated into chaos as residents demanded answers about why their premium development had become an aquatic disaster zone. Margaret received a full report from her neighbor Frank, who attended the meeting out of curiosity. According to Frank, Blackstone had tried to blame the flooding on climate change and unprecedented weather patterns, but the residents weren't buying it. Mrs. Patterson stood up and asked why her cousin's farm 3 miles away never floods even though it's in the same weather system. Frank reported with obvious glee. Then old Mr. Chen pointed out that the flooding started right after they cut down your trees. By the end of the meeting, half the room was talking about suing Blackstone for building in a flood zone without proper drainage. The legal avalanche that followed was swift and comprehensive. 17 homeowners filed a class action lawsuit against Blackstone Development for fraud and negligent construction. The state environmental agency opened an investigation into unpermitted alterations to natural drainage patterns. The county revoked Blackstone's development permits for his next 3 projects pending a comprehensive review of his environmental compliance. Margaret's personal vindication came on a crisp November morning when Richard,